Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone had a great first day at our national meeting, and we're very excited for our full day today. We've got just an incredible lineup. So everyone have a good night last night? All right, good. Everyone got their coffee? Everyone's ready? Great. Well, this has been an amazing first-time experience for me. I've met so many just incredible people. I've met people from España and Indonesia and China, India, Azerbaijan and Russia and Ukraine and Singapore. It really truly is just an international gathering of people. It seems like business school isn't enough for everyone here. You also have to be running a business at the same time. So I met someone last night who's starting his own line of snacks. I met somebody who bought an aloe vera farm in Colombia. Who's marketing that around the world. So it's just a fascinating group of people. I've learned so much already, and one of the things we hope is that you'll all learn from each other and carry what you learned here today into your classrooms and into your boardrooms. So just a few reminders. Please continue to engage on social media. There's just been so many great postings on Instagram and other things already, so please continue to do that. It's through you that this organization will continue to grow. If you haven't already, please sign up for our new text alert service. This will give you updates and notices when we're doing our treks and other events like that. Just text SmithSoc to 59769. If you have any questions about that, please just ask one of the staff. A reminder, please silence your cell phones throughout the day. Thank you very much. And so let's kick it off this morning. To start, we are going to talk about our namesake, Adam Smith. We all know he published The Wealth of Nations in 1776, and yet here we are still talking about him. So why? Why does he remain relevant? And what insights can we learn from him, from the role of an ethical business person to questions of poverty and inequality? So to explore the enduring lessons of Adam Smith, I'd like to welcome to the stage one of the original thinkers and supporters behind the Adam Smith Society, Professor James Otteson. Dr. Addison is professor and the Thomas W. Smith Presidential Chair in Business Ethics at Wake Forest University. He's taught economics and philosophy around the world at the University of Alabama, Georgetown, Bowling Green, NYU, the University of Edinburgh, among others. He's an expert on the moral foundations of capitalism, and he lectures widely on Adam Smith, classical liberalism, political economy, and business ethics. He's the author of a new book released this past February called Honorable Business, which explores whether there can be such a thing as honorable business and how business contributes to both moral and economic well-being. He's also the editor of What Adam Smith Knew, a collection of selected writings compiled specifically for the Adam Smith Society. He'll give remarks. To ask questions toward the end of his remarks, please come to the microphones that you see here. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. James Otteson.
Thank you very much for that excellent introduction. All that and I'm still a disappointment to my mother-in-law. Thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure and honor, especially to see some of the founding people of the Adam Smith Society, including Marilyn Fedak, and to see what it has become. So thank you for being here. Good morning. Good morning. Okay, we are still like, all right. So my PhD is in philosophy. I got my degree at the University of Chicago. I wanted to write on Adam Smith's moral philosophy, and I wasn't allowed to do that because I was told that philosophers don't study Adam Smith, only economists do, and badly. So they made me write my dissertation on both Adam Smith and David Hume's moral philosophy, fair enough. But my current position is in a business school at Wake Forest University, which is a bit odd to be a philosophy PhD in a business school. There are not many philosophy PhDs in business schools. There are a few. We all know each other. We are a small but brave band. But what I wanted to talk about today is the connection between why we should study Adam Smith and what it might have to do for business education today in the few minutes we have. So why Adam Smith matters today. Adam Smith, so his Wealth of Nations was published in what year? 1776. Very good. So that was an auspicious year, obviously. That was also the year in which David Hume died. Is that what you were thinking? David Hume died in 1776, also the Declaration. But it turns out that Adam Smith had an actually rather profound effect on many of the American founders. So here are some of the readers of Adam Smith. They all had copies of his book, The Wealth of Nations. Thomas Jefferson also had a copy of the Theory of Moral Sentiments, which was published earlier in 1759. And in fact, Jefferson went on to suggest that at Mr. Jefferson's university, there should be a course of reading, and these were the only required books. Locke's Second Treatise of Government, Condorcet's work on the progress of the human mind, and, as you can see, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. Jefferson did not even decide to include his own redacted version of the Bible. So Jefferson, who was no shrinking violet when it came to his own estimation of his intellect, actually reduced the Bible, got rid of all the extraneous things, reduced it to 20 pages, but he did not require students to read it. So here are the two questions I'd like to talk about today. What's the role of business in a humane and just society? And how is prosperity enabled? And the second one is, was Adam Smith right? That second question is a very hard question, much harder than you might think. It took us a long time to come to some understanding of it, but let's begin with the first part. Can there be such a thing as a moral purpose of business? That picture there is the collection of writings that I put together with the help of the Adam Smith Society for a course I teach at Wake Forest called Why Business? And the subtitle of it is, What's the Role of Business in a Just and Humane Society? And here's one of the things I discovered. So I came to Wake Forest 5 years ago. One of the things I discovered is that people who study business, students who are going into business, are often asked by their peers, their colleagues in other disciplines, why are you studying business? Why would you do that? And it seems that these are the only two conceivable answers. And many business students are a little defensive and maybe even a little embarrassed that they can't offer anything other than, well, you just want to make money or get a job. Now, do business students want to make money and get a job? Sure. Is that true for other students as well? Yes. Still, if that's all there is, it doesn't seem like a particularly inspiring vision. So can we give it a more inspiring vision? I'd like to ask you for a second to consider these two professions, medicine and business. So in many ways, they're similar. So first of all, they are both professions. In both cases, they have specialties, they have subspecialties. In both cases, you might require a lot of technical training in order to succeed, and it might also take years of practice and training before you become successful. And in both cases, if you are successful, you may well make a lot of money. So in those ways, they're very similar, but consider for a second how differently those two professions are viewed in the wider culture. So for example, no one says to the medical doctor, well, now that you've been successful, you need to give back to society. But they say that to the business professional, don't they? Have you heard people say that? Business should give back? You ever wondered about that phrase? Thought about it? Notice people don't say that business should give. They say it should give back. Well, when you were a child, if your mother said to you, you need to give that back, what does that mean you did? You took something that did not belong to you. You need to return it to its rightful owner. Well, is that what people think that business is, or what business people do? Well, I would like to suggest, I'm afraid, that I think, yes, that's what a lot of people think about business. If you're successful in business, they might not know exactly what you did wrong, but they're pretty sure you must have done something wrong. So when I talk to business students, I ask them, and I said this to the faculty at Wake Forest as well, if it's true. So suppose we consider all the arguments in favor of a market economy, all the objections people raise to a market economy. If at the end of all of that examination, we think, yes, business really is something that you need to atone for as if it were a sin. If you're successful, you need to do something to make up for it. Then I think the proper response to that is not to say people should give back. It's to say, don't do it at all. I mean, you don't want to say to the thief, well, it's fine as long as you give some of it to charity afterwards. What you say is, don't steal. You don't say to the murderer, it's okay to keep killing as long as some of the people you kill are bad. You say, stop killing. And you certainly wouldn't want to have a school or a network of schools that train people to be really good and clever thieves. So if what we're going to do is to actually consider dedicating our lives as faculty or students, business people to business, then we better have some way of understanding business such that it's valuable in itself. That the actual activity of business can be valuable in itself, not for what it might do later, not for how it might give or give back, but the actual activity itself. And by the way, I'll just give this as a friendly piece of advice. I tell this to my students. They don't always listen. But I've told to my children, they definitely don't listen. If you're about to do something or thinking about doing something and you're pretty sure that afterwards you're going to have to make up for it, that's a red flag. Maybe you shouldn't do it. So that means that we need to figure out, is there a way that we can actually consider business to be valuable in itself? And if not, then maybe we shouldn't do it. Okay, so that means we need to understand the proper context of business. So I mentioned that I'm a philosopher by training. So I'm just going to give you a couple of steps, and these are really based on a kind of Aristotelian vision of the human life. But let me just give you 5 steps, only 5, that I think frame the proper context of business. So that's the first part of it. We all want a just and humane society. Wherever we are in the political or economic spectrum, everybody wants a just and humane society. Now, we may have different conceptions of what a just and humane society is. We might have different definitions of justice, different definitions of humanity. I want to punt on that. I mean by just and humane society whatever you mean by that. So I don't want this to be a controversial claim, and I think the second step isn't controversial either, at least I hope not. A humane and just society depends on a variety of institutions. Political institutions, economic institutions, moral institutions, cultural, if you can think of culture as an institution, but a variety of public social institutions. Okay, so I don't think that's too controversial yet. The next step gets a little more controversial. Included among those institutions is a properly functioning market economy. Now, I know you're all philosophers at heart. You look at that statement, a properly functioning market economy. Which word in that statement is doing a lot of work? Properly. What exactly is a properly functioning market economy? Okay, we're almost there. Step 4, I'm going to tell you, a properly functioning market economy is one that includes honorable business. Now, what do you want to know? What? Very good. What's honorable business? Here it is. Honorable business is industries, firms, and individuals, you, creating value. And what I mean by that is, while making your own lives better, simultaneously making other people's lives better at the same time. So is it morally wrong to want to improve your own situation and improve your own life? No. What's morally wrong is if you're doing that at another's expense. That's morally wrong. But if you do that in such a way that you're simultaneously benefiting someone else, that's creating real value. That's creating mutual value, and that's actually the key to growing prosperity. So my idea is that business people, firms, industries who contribute value in this way are part of what I call this hierarchy of moral purpose. So this is, if you're doing this right, there's only one way you can get happiness for yourself. And what do you think that is? Make money. Happiness for oneself is possible only by creating happiness for others at the same time. That will be honorable business. Okay, so this is just to show you that I know how to use PowerPoint. Even a philosopher can use PowerPoint. I did have to learn PowerPoint moving to a business school because apparently that's the only way you're allowed to communicate with students. But you see, those are the 5 pieces, and the arrows are supposed to indicate that they're all interlocking. So here's my vision. I would consider it a win. If somebody comes out of the Wake Forest Business School, if any business school, and they're going to take a job somewhere, they're going to work at FedEx, they're going to work on Wall Street, they're going to work at Deloitte, wherever they're going to work. If somebody says, well, what are you going to be doing at Deloitte? The answer they give is, I'm contributing to a just and humane society. And if somebody says, what on earth do you mean by that? They say, well, give me 2 minutes and I'll explain it to you. Because each of these pieces should ultimately contribute to this highest level of moral purpose. Okay, so that's talking about business. What did Adam Smith have to contribute to this? So there he is. There's a picture of him. By the way, that's the only side of Adam Smith's face that you will ever see. So he never sat for a portrait. And the images we have of him are only of his right side. Apparently, he thought his left side was uglier. All right? That's what he apparently thought. And he would not allow anybody to paint him. So here's what Adam Smith says. Little else is required to carry a state to the highest degree of opulence, from the lowest barbarism, but peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice, all the rest being brought about by the natural course of things. So peace, easy taxes, and just a tolerable, not a perfect, just tolerable administration of justice. Everything else will happen all on its own. One wonders if that's really all that it is required. That seems awfully easy. Well, was he right? So what has business actually done? So global business, large-scale markets are relatively new phenomena in human history. They have not existed throughout human history. There's almost always been trading. A lot of it was reciprocal trading. We give something, the same thing back and forth, but the trading was quite restricted to people that you actually knew, had personal knowledge of it. Global trading, like what we see today, is a relatively new phenomenon. What have been their effects? Now, I'll just give you a couple of graphs, so even philosophers can make a graph. Actually, I'm just borrowing this from someone else. So what that is world product divided by the number of people alive in the world at the time over the last 400 years. So those are two slightly different ways of calculating. One is from Angus Maddison, who died about a decade ago now, should have won the Nobel Prize for the work he did on trying to do this. This is purchasing power parity, trying to compare apples to apples, if you probably all know what that means. The other line, the red line, is from Brad DeLong, who's an economist at Berkeley. That's an interesting hockey stick, isn't it? So if you're a social scientist and you're looking at that graph, what part of it is the interesting one? So I said the two lines are slightly different ways of calculating. That's, I think, less important than looking at how consistent those lines are. But how much further back can we go? How long back in human history do we have good data? Well, Brad DeLong actually thinks you can make estimates to 1 million years ago, so early hominins on the planet. That's a bit dodgy, using rather indirect data, but there's quite a bit of consensus among economic historians that we can make pretty good estimates going back about 12,000 years ago, so about 10,000 BC. I'm going to show you that graph next. Do you have a guess of what it'll look like? There it is. Now that is a hockey stick. So the blue line goes back to year 1, so that's the last, it's about 2015 years. The red line, that's Brad DeLong, goes all the way back to 10,000 BC. So we have a very long, low, no change in human existence. In fact, the average human being alive in 1800 was no better off than the average human being alive 100,000 years ago. There was effectively no change. You had to wait a very long time for the next iPhone to come out. But if you just look at that graph and you notice, think about the great civilizations of the past. Think about the pharaohs and the pyramids, not a blip. Think about the Roman Empire, not a blip. Think about the Song dynasty around 1000 AD in China, not a blip. None of those things made any difference to overall levels of wealth, and then something happened. So as I said, if you're a social scientist, what part of that graph is the one you want to explain? It's the crook of the hockey stick. So what's not interesting is when everything is exactly the same and nothing changes. What's interesting is why something changed. So congratulations, ladies and gentlemen. You and I are alive at the most prosperous time in human history ever. We have more wealth, more resources, more freedom, more longevity than any human beings have ever had in the entire history of humanity. So when you hear people complaining about how awful things are, a little perspective might help. So what is that long, low red line? It's between 1 and 3 contemporary dollars per person per day. Never really varied. Just think about that. So Deirdre McCloskey, the economic historian Deirdre McCloskey, has called this the Great Enrichment. And before about 1800, that was one of the most famous phrases from political philosophy from Hobbes, the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Between $1 and $3 per person per day, could you live on, let's be generous, $3 per day in contemporary dollars for everything? So food, clothing, shelter, your Netflix account, playing Fortnite, all of the things you need. I mean, maybe you could. Wouldn't be easy. And by the way, there are some people on Earth who are still living at that historically low level. Blessedly, it's the number and proportion are going down rapidly, and we're at the lowest proportions ever in human history. It's about 5%, but there still are some. So what does it look like today in the world? It's $48, again, constant dollars per person per day. In the United States, $164 per person per day. So a 16-fold real increase worldwide and something like a 55-fold increase, real increase in America. Today, we're at about 5% of humanity at that level, and it's falling rapidly. And during your lifetimes, we may be on the precipice of, for the first time in human history, eliminating what the United Nations calls the absolute level of poverty. So it may be in just the next decade or two that there will be effectively no people living at that level, which has never happened in human history. This is, ladies and gentlemen, is an enormous human achievement that almost nobody knows about. So a question I want to ask you is, what caused it? What happened? So are human beings, think about human beings 12,000 years ago versus today. Are they biologically different? No. Psychologically different? No. If you took a child from the Fertile Crescent in 10,000 BC and brought that child and raised him in New York City, what would the child be doing? Playing Fortnite like everybody else. No psychological difference, no biological difference. Did climate change? Of course it did. Went up and down. We had ice ages, little ice ages. We had warming periods, and yet nothing. So what did change? Do you have your theory about that? So what explains it? I'd like to offer you my own little theory. I think it's a shift in morality and culture and then institutions, not the other way around. So now I'll confess that there are Nobel Prize winners on various sides of this issue. There's no real consensus about it. So I'm giving you what my own view is, but there are people you can find on the other side. In particular, there's a lot of people who are working on institutions. They're called the institutionalists or the new institutionalists, having the right institutions. My suggestion is that what precipitated the change in institutions and the uptake of the effects of institutions was first a change in culture and morality. Now, what is that change? Suppose you have something I want, whatever it is. It could be your labor, your love, your laptop. If you have a laptop and I would like to have your laptop, there are two ways I could get that from you, aren't there? What are the two ways I could get that from you? I like that the first one I heard was steal it. Okay, so yes, I could steal it. I could, I guess, kill you and take it. I could defraud you. I could say I'll give you $10,000 for it in 2 weeks, and then I run off to Mexico or whatever and don't give you the money. So I could steal, defraud. So what might we call those things? Let's call them extraction. The key aspect of extraction is not voluntary. So that's using either deception or force to take something from somebody unwillingly. And that's should we call that an exchange? If I steal your laptop from you, is that an exchange? I don't know, it's a transaction sort of. But that's what economists call zero sum. You've all heard that phrase, a zero sum? Plus one laptop for me, minus one laptop for you, plus one minus one is zero. That's not an increase in overall wealth, that's just shifting wealth from one place to another. It's like somebody who goes to the beach and builds a sandcastle and says, look at my creation, look at all that new sand I created. Well, no, you didn't create new sand, you just moved it from one place to another. That's exactly what the pharaohs did with their pyramids. Took a lot of capital to build those pyramids. Where'd they get that capital? Slavery, colonization, theft, right. The Romans with the Colosseum and the aqueducts and the roads, where did they get all of that capital? Slavery, conquest, theft. That, in fact, has been the tried and true way that human beings have gotten whatever they've been able to get, arrogate to themselves in human history. As soon as one person or group gets enough power over other persons or groups, what do? They attack them and take their stuff. That doesn't create new wealth, that just shifts it from one place to another, and in fact, it creates an enormous disincentive to creating anything worth stealing. Because if you start to build something, what's going to happen? Somebody will notice and will come along and try to take it from you. That's what explains that long, low red line. So what began to change was the other way that we could. So what's the other way I could get your laptop from you? I could make you an offer which you are free to accept or decline. So what might we call that? Let's call that cooperation. And what's the distinguishing feature of that? It's mutually voluntary, and it's not zero sum, it's positive sum. So if I offer you, let's say, we put the laptop example, you go into Starbucks and you order your double pumpkin spice mocha latte, and the barista says that'll be $5, you give the $5, you get your latte. Which of you benefited from that exchange? That's a little pop quiz. You both did, right? We know you both did because if either one of you didn't benefit from it, then you would have said no thanks and gone somewhere else. So that means it's a positive sum exchange, positive value on both sides. So here are my questions for you. Which of those two is more moral? You should not have to think about that long. Okay, the answer, I trust, is obvious. Which of them leads to increasing overall prosperity? Same one. Cooperation. Now, if that seems obvious to you, as I hope and trust that it does, I would suggest to you for your thought that that has not seemed obvious to most human beings throughout most of our history. The idea that you should ask somebody permission before you take something from them, or take them, is a relatively new idea. And institutions like limited government, the ones that Smith described, peace, easy taxes, a tolerable administration of justice, those only make sense and are only supported by a society in which people come to have the idea that the morally proper way to deal with others is cooperatively rather than extractively. And as that idea began to spread to more and more places in the world, starting early in the 16th, a little bit in the 7th, then a little bit more in the 17th century, really began in a few places to take hold in the 18th century, that began the virtuous multiplier effect, like the miracle of compounding interest. And as more and more people began to have this idea, they engaged in more and more positive sum, cooperative exchanges, which led to trust that enabled more people to enter the markets. And as more people were able to do this, that's what's accounted for that huge spike upwards. So that means if we want that line to continue going in that direction as opposed to some other direction, we have to not only understand that, but we have to encourage not extraction, but cooperation. And here's my suggestion. Cooperative business is honorable business. And this, it has a kind of Adam Smithian invisible hand effect. Not only does it enable the parties to a particular exchange to benefit, so if it's mutually voluntary, it'll be mutually beneficial to those parties, but it has these ancillary other effects that help uphold the culture and institutions that enable other people to have those kinds of exchanges as well. And so by almost as if by an invisible hand, it can lead to greater prosperity for the society more generally. Now, is money the only thing that matters? Some of you are not so sure, okay? Here's my answer. No, it's not, but what I would argue is that what wealth can do is enable other things that do matter. If you're worried about whether you can eat today or whether your children can eat today, you're not thinking about writing the great American novel or where your children will go to college, you're thinking about, can we eat today? What wealth can begin to do is to address those more basic pressing concerns so that we can then begin to turn our attention to the other things that enable a life of meaning and purpose. So wealth has benefits far beyond the material, and so I run something at Wake Forest called the Eudaimonia Institute. One of the things that we do is we study, eudaimonia is Aristotle's word for human flourishing. We try to figure out what really is genuine human flourishing and what are the various kinds of institutions that encourage it and what get in the way. So we're among the many people who study these sorts of things. So we've looked at all of these things. It turns out they all correlate positively and with statistical significance with commercial society. So if the more market-based your country's economy is, the higher you will score on all of these things. Now, you all know the phrase correlation is not causation. Are these correlations or causations? They're correlations. It's very hard to figure out causal relationships when you're dealing with human beings because human beings don't like to be put into controlled experiments. And if you only had a few of these correlations, it might not be very interesting, but when you have this many that all point in the same direction, and really just about every way we've been able to come up with that might be a proxy, everything we can measure that might be a proxy for human flourishing, it all points in the same direction. So that begins to make a very positive case. Now let me conclude. So I think I've made what I think is a positive case. Let me conclude with two worries that you might have about a market economy. One is called luck egalitarianism. That's a mouthful. Maybe you've all heard of that phrase. The idea is that luck plays a role in our lives, which it does. Some people have good luck, some people have bad luck. But if some of your success is due to luck, good parents maybe, or good schooling, or other things, you lived in a country that wasn't war-torn, if it's just luck, you can't claim any credit for it. So if some proportion of your success is due to luck, good luck, but that also means that for other people, some proportion of their relative lack of success might be due to bad luck, in which case maybe the moral thing to do is to equalize or attempt to equalize the effects of luck in people's lives by redistributing some of the fruits of the lucky to the people who haven't been so lucky. Okay, that's the objection. And is it the case that some people succeed in market economies on the basis of luck, or at least partly on the basis of luck? Sure. So this is a potential objection to market economies. So I want to try to offend as many people as I can here in the audience. I view that as one of my duties as a professor, to offend people, push them out of their comfort zones. Here's the proposition I want you to consider. I think this is an Adam Smithian proposition. Undeserved bad luck and reasonable disappointment don't necessarily mean anybody owes you anything. So here's what I mean by that. If you had bad luck and we all agree that you didn't deserve the bad luck, and if you had disappointment and we all agree it was reasonable, we'd be disappointed too, those two things even together don't necessarily mean anybody owes you anything. And let me give you one quick example that might make you think that's more plausible than maybe you're currently thinking it is. So Jack and Jill are two students at Wake Forest University. Their names have been changed to protect the innocent. They're seniors. They've been dating for some time. They're beginning to think, Jack's beginning to think maybe Jill's the one. Jill's beginning to think maybe Jack is the one. It's now March of their senior year. They're starting to think, should we be thinking about coordinating our plans after we graduate? Jack calls Jill on a Sunday evening and says, Jill, I'd like to take you out to dinner next Saturday night. She says, great. And he says, it's going to be special. And she says, it's going to be special. And he says, it's going to be special. So she hangs up the phone and says to her roommates, hey, Jack has invited me out to dinner next week. He says it's going to be special. You don't think he's going to ask me to marry him, do you? And they say, he is totally going to ask you to marry him. So she begins to think about what would this look like, what would it be. She writes her name on things, Mrs. Jack, just to see how it works, how it feels. She decides, if he asks me, I'm going to say yes. What Jack does after he hangs up the phone with her is he calls a restaurant, makes a reservation for two, and he says, I'm going to ask my girlfriend to marry me. And they say, great, wonderful, we'll have rose petals and things. It'll be wonderful. That's Sunday. On Monday, Jill is in a class on Monday morning, not really thinking about the class. And on her way out of the class, she gets stopped by Joe. Now, who's Joe? Well, Joe's just some guy who's been in the class the whole semester she didn't really pay much attention to. On this day, for some reason, he said, hey, Jill, I didn't catch what the professor said at the end of class. Did you happen to catch it? And she said, oh, let me look at my notes. And she looks at her notes, and she looks at Joe, and there's a bit of a spark. So he says, Jill, you want to go get a cup of coffee or something? And she says, sure. So they go get a cup of coffee, and they spend a couple of hours and miss a couple of classes, and pretty soon it's lunchtime, and Joe says, oh my gosh, time's really flying. Would you like to go get a bite to eat or something? And she says, well, I did have a midterm review session, but I don't need to go to that. Sure, let's. They end up spending the rest of the afternoon together, walking around campus and whatnot. Now it's dinner time. Joe says, hey, Jill, you want to go get another bite to eat and maybe get some pizza or something? And she says, oh, well, you know, I was supposed to go see my grandmother in intensive care, but I'm sure she's fine. Yeah. So they go get a bite to eat. They wind up talking all night long. Now it's the morning. Sun coming up over campus. Joe looks at the sun, looks at Jill, and he says, you know, I've never met anybody like you before, and I've never had the feelings I'm having right now before. Can't believe what I'm about to say, Jill, but marry me right now. Let's go to Justice of the Peace right now and get married. Suddenly, Jill snaps out of whatever she'd been in and looks at her phone, and there are 900 texts from all of her friends. Where are you? Are you dead? Many of the texts were from Jack. Remember him? What happened to you? It turns out Jack, that same time when she was in class, at the same time Jack was at a jewelry store buying an engagement ring. So he had pulled out his student loan money. No, I'm kidding. No. So while all these thoughts are whirring around in Jill's head, she says yes. And they get married right then, that very day. Okay. Now think about Jack for a second. Remember him? So Jack, was that undeserved bad luck that Jack had? The day he was going to ask his longtime girlfriend to marry him, she happens to run into some guy that she decides to elope with? Seems like bad luck. If he's disappointed, would you agree that it's reasonable disappointment? You'd be disappointed too? Seems reasonable. Here's the question. Is he owed anything? Could he sue Jill for the future affection he expected to get from her and now won't? Or for the investment of time and energy into the relationship that now he has now come to a fruitless end? Or the 9 children he expected her to bear to him or something? Obviously, the answer to all of that is no, and the reason is very important. The reason the answer is no, he can't do any of those things, is because he has no right to Jill. She's a free person. She gets to make the decisions she wants to make, even if they arise in part because of luck, even if it leads to disappointment for others. She's a free person. So is he owed anything? Well, if you're a friend of Jack's, maybe you take him out to a bar and say, dude, that's a bummer, buy him a beer, sure. You introduce him to Jenny or Julie or Jerry or whatever. Any of those things are fine, but it's not an injustice requiring compensation. How does it relate to markets? Same thing in the markets. You own a coffee shop. I go to your coffee shop every day. Coffee shop opens up across the street, and I decide to go to that one, and I decide not to come back to yours. Maybe all your customers go to the other coffee shop. Is that bad luck for you that a coffee shop opened up across the street from you? Yes. If your customers decide not to come to your shop anymore, does that cause reasonable disappointment? Yes. Are you entitled to any compensation for that? Nope. For exactly the same reason. You have no more right to your patrons or your patrons' resources than Jack had to Jill. One last, so if you'll forgive me, I have one last. I have to talk about inequality. Do markets lead to inequality? Yeah. Should we worry about that? Let me give you a quick thought experiment. Consider two people, A and B. A is much wealthier than B. Let's say A has 10 times, let's say A has 100 times as much wealth as B. Now, without knowing anything else about A and B, do you think a society must be unjust in which one person can have 100 times as much wealth as another person, that there's no way for that to have happened with justice? It's a failure of justice, or maybe if you like, a failure of social justice. Well, you think about that on your own. Let me tell you who my A and B are. Here's A. You recognize him? Who's that? Bill Gates. What is Bill Gates worth? Well, it depends a bit on market returns. I checked this morning. It's about $90 billion. 90 billion with a B. Well, it's a billion among friends. It goes up and down a little bit. Who is the poor person who has to soldier on at only 1/100th the level of Bill Gates? There are many people I could have picked, but I picked a neighbor of mine. Who's that? He's not actually my neighbor. He lives in North Carolina, which is where I live now. I don't actually live near Michael Jordan. But poor Michael Jordan has to soldier on only $900 million. So his worth is only about $900 million. Now, obviously, that's an extreme example, but what is that supposed to prove? Here's what I think that indicates. What matters when you make these comparisons is how did the wealthier person get it? Did he get it by force, fraud, theft, in other words, through extraction, or did he get it cooperatively? That makes a moral difference. And then, of course, when you talk about the less wealthy person, the absolute quality of life matters as well. Michael Jordan is doing fine by any objective or world standards. So the idea that we should redistribute some of Bill Gates' fortune to Michael Jordan to somehow narrow the gap just seems absurd. So the absolute level of poverty, I think, is what matters. But maybe you think that that's an extreme example, which it is. So let's raise the order of magnitude. Are there people in the United States who have 1,000 times more wealth than others? How about 10,000 times? 100,000 times? How about 180,000 times? So who is the poor schmuck who has to live on only 180,000th of Bill Gates' wealth? That's me. Actually, I rounded up a little bit. So the question, I think, and this is the question I'll leave you with this for inequality, and we can take some questions about it. If you could change one thing about the world, but only one thing, which of those two would you change? Would you eliminate poverty, or would you eliminate inequality? Well, I mean, I have my own answer to that, but what I would say is I think this is a real question, because the only institutions that we've been able to come up with that can alleviate poverty also allow for inequality. We may all be getting better, but not at the same rates. Similarly, the only ways we've been able to come up with to keep people relatively equal is that long, low red line. We're equal, relatively equal, but we're all equally poor. So that seems to be the real choice we face. So here's my conclusion. I think Adam Smith was onto something. Cooperative exchange within markets, not extractive, not crony institutions, market institutions generate increasing wealth. They lead to many other benefits, and they also exemplify what I think are the proper moral relations between people. Cooperating and requiring mutual mutually voluntary assent before any exchange is the way we should deal with people, all people. It leads to mutual respect. So what Smith was suggesting is that you might get both prosperity and morality, and so conceived, it might even be the case that honorable business is a moral calling. With that, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Thank you. We're happy to take some questions, I think, if anybody would like to ask a question. Yes, ma'am, please.
Hello, thank you for speaking. My name is Salome. I'm from UVA, Darden School of Business. So I was thinking about your last slide, and it could be argued that putting poverty...
Which one, this one or which one? I'll go to
poverty versus inequality.
Yeah.
You could argue that it's a false dichotomy, that you could try to alleviate both. And you can say that there are intrinsic reasons why having inequality is morally fine, but you can also say that in a society, if you have high inequality, it leads to instability, and then you have social pressures, which if you want to avoid, you just have to think about it. So how would you address the fact that people are unhappy with inequality, whether it's right or wrong?
So there are two parts to your question. One is, can you address both of them simultaneously? And the other one is, even putting that aside, could people be caused anxiety or unhappiness if there's a great deal of inequality? So in the interest of, and we can talk about this a little bit afterwards, I'll give you a short answer, maybe not entirely sufficient. The first one, can you address both of them simultaneously? Empirical evidence suggests no. So it looks like what happens with inequality is as prosperity begins to grow, inequality also increases, in fact, at a quite rapid rate. But it might begin to level off and then even decline in something like a Kuznets curve. I don't know if you know this phrase, a Kuznets curve, so it's an inverted U. So the empirical evidence suggests that when you're extremely poor, there's very little inequality, or when your country's very poor, there's very little inequality. You might have one or two people who have all of the wealth, the king or the leader, but for everybody else, it's relatively equal. As prosperity begins to increase, inequality then grows. So you get people at various gradations. That continues to increase. It's like what we're seeing in China right now, in India, and other places that are really beginning to develop in prosperity. It may begin to level off, that there's some question about that, but it looks as if you won't get that increase in prosperity unless you have, unless you allow at least initially inequality. So that's what the empirical evidence suggests. The other one about people being unhappy. So we've done, in my institute, is one of the ones that has done quite a bit of research about this. It turns out that the majority of the people worldwide who are worried about inequality are wealthy Westerners. So poor people in developing countries, they're not bothered by it at all. In fact, it comes in something like 75th on their list of priorities. Now, why would that be? I mean, we might have different speculations about that, why that would be, but it seems as if what they're much more interested in is the opportunity. So they don't care that you're very wealthy. What they care about is, do I have the chance to become wealthy? And that doesn't really become a concern for people until not only they reach by world standards, a relatively high level of prosperity, and they've enjoyed it for some time. That's when they begin to get worried about it. So my speculative suggestion would be that while there are still some people at that historical low of poverty, I think it's a price worth paying some of us might be more anxious about the inequality. Once all of them are out, once we've eliminated absolute poverty, then I think we can begin to turn our attention to other concerns. Thank you for your question.
Good morning, Professor.
Yes, sir. Yes.
My name is Neil. I'm from the Kelley School of Business. Thanks for sharing that little vignette that tells us that a lot happens in schools outside of education as well. My question to you is...
The one thing you're going to remember from the talk, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Absolutely. My question to you is, are we doing injustice to the morality of Smith by extending free markets to every human institution, such as even education? Because Smith argues at some point that certain level of wisdom be made available to everyone.
Yes.
And I think that he was implicitly making an argument for making education a government prerogative.
So there are two questions there, I think. One is, what did Adam Smith really have in mind? And another one is sort of the general question of what level of government intervention might be plausible or might be required in a humane and just society. Mm-hmm. Smith himself did entertain the possibility of government provision of education. So he was not a doctrinaire, laissez-faire. free market person that we might describe him today. Although what he did suggest was the only thing that everybody needed was to learn how to read, write, and account. He called it account, not arithmetic. But if you ever wondered where the 3 R's came from, have you heard of the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic? Adam Smith. But he said that's the only level of education that everybody needs. And he said, so there might be an argument for providing it through general taxation, although he said, how many years do you need to learn how to read, write, and do arithmetic? Do you need college? You shouldn't. High school, middle school, so it might only be a couple of years. And he said that the government should always provide less than half of the overall cost, because that way incentives will be properly aligned. If all of the cost is provided by government, then teachers will pay attention to the government and not the students. But putting the particular arguments from Smith aside, I think a Smithian view would be that this is an empirical question. He was an empirical political scientist. What is the signature of institutions, cultural and otherwise, that seem to lead to increasing prosperity? So Smith never used the term capitalism. He never used the term free market. What he was interested in is the power of free people. So when you say, should we spread markets to everything, I think a Smithian would say something like, what we should do is acknowledge the freedom of every person and let them make their own decisions. When we talk about markets, that sounds like you're talking about a thing that's being imposed on people. That's the different orientation from Smith. Smithian orientation is when you recognize people's equal moral agency, that just means you allow them to make decisions in their own cases about how to improve their own lives. And it turns out, not only can they do that, but others can benefit as well. So it would be an empirical question for him.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Are we?
Hello, my name is Svetlana. I'm from UNC. Thank you for your lecture. My question is, you made a distinction between extraction and cooperation, and you told that cooperation is an honorable activity.
Yes.
And I would like to give just some numbers. In 2015, oil and gas companies received $10 billion in subsidies. Walmart received $6.2 billion in subsidies every year. Amazon demanded $4.6 billion subsidies for quarter 2. Pharma companies receive subsidies all the time. And Google and Facebook use data of customers and sell it without the customer's consent. Okay. My question is, how is it extraction or cooperation? How much is it different from your example of pharaohs and building pyramids? And do you think this business is honorable? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I won't dispute your numbers. I don't know. I'll take your word for it on the numbers of the. So one thing, let me go back to that. Do I see the first bullet point there? Not extractive or crony. So I think what we see in a lot of countries, including the United States, is a great deal of cronyism. I wouldn't call it crony capitalism because that's an oxymoronic phrase. It's cronyism, and what does that mean? So seeking subsidies, seeking protections from competition. Amazon, it was Facebook, wasn't it Zuckerberg who came out recently and said what we need is federal regulation? Do you wonder why he would say something like that? He's already an entrenched success. If there's a new regulation that he himself or his company itself helps craft, who are going to be the people who would have a hard time meeting the burden, the compliance burden of that, any new entrants into the market? Not him. So it creates a set of perverse incentives. So the short answer to your question is I think a lot of that is not cooperative, it is extractive, and I think that's the nature of cronyism. Cronyism is asking for special favors, not that people give you because they voluntarily want to do it, but because you're using the coercive power of the state to subsidize yourself, protect you against losses, protect you against competition, et cetera. So I would not call that honorable business. Now, there's one little caveat about that. Suppose you're a business person and you operate or want to operate in an environment that is dominated by cronyism. In other words, the only way you can possibly succeed is by playing in that game, even if you think it's wrong. So that's a very difficult case, and I would say there might not be one answer for all cases like that. So if you're a business person, you want to succeed in the United States, let's say, you are going to have to deal with regulators, you're going to have to hire lobbyists, you're going to have to spend time or have people spend time in Washington, whether you like to do it or not. So does that mean that all of that, I would consider that a kind of defensive honorable business. In other words, you're still trying to provide a service to your customers, your clients, your employees, et cetera, benefiting yourself and others as well, but trying to do it within an environment that may be increasingly hostile to exactly that kind of activity. That's a complex moral case, and I think it just indicates how complex human life is. But I will say that that sort of hierarchy I showed, the just and humane society and all of those steps, I don't think that will always, and I don't think that's the purpose of it. I don't think it will always tell you exactly what you should do, but it will rule some things out. So there will be lots of cases where you think, if we go this route, if we ask for this subsidy, we engage, we want to limit the market in a certain kind of way, we're thinking about going into a market, hiring a person, partnering with somebody, some of those ways will look extractive. Some of them will look cooperative. And if it looks extractive, then this can give you guidelines to say, maybe no, maybe we should look at something else. And I will say maybe a last thing to say. One of the great things about being alive today in the world is that there are indefinitely many ways of creating prosperity. There's virtually no limit to the number of ways that any human being with your brain can contribute to the overall prosperity of the world. And so if there's one way that involves extraction, you say no. If there's another way where you're not quite sure, there'll be lots and lots of other ways where you can say that creates mutual value, that generates prosperity, and that's honorable business. And that's what I think it's our moral duty to choose those ways.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much.